the fact that Russia is losing so many commanders, some assassinated, some targeted by the Ukrainians, some removed by the Russians. And we don't know, for instance, Gerasimov is supposed to be in charge of the whole operation. He's only made one remote appearance. There's no indication that he's really in charge of this since the failed march on Moscow by Prigozhin and the Wagner group. Sorovikin, who is the deputy commander of the whole operation, one of the three deputies, he's not been seen at all. So there's nobody at the top who's obviously in command. And you can see what that's doing. I mean, down at the battlefront, people are just carrying on with their orders with no flexibility. Just local commanders are making their decisions, and they're throwing troops in one after another, and they're using this concept of disposable troops who are there to take the fire, blocking troops behind them who are there to shoot them if they retreat, and then regulars behind them again to move forward if there is any gain. And this is pretty fundamental. I mean, this is the biggest change in NATO militarily and geopolitically since German rearmament in 1955. And if you look at it from the Scandinavian point of view, Norway, Sweden, Finland, Denmark are all now in a common security arrangement, and that hasn't happened since 1397 in the Union of Kalmar. And I say that only because that was the days of the Teutonic Knights in Lithuania. But I say that to indicate how strategically, historically important all the changes are in Europe now. And so that was one thing, that the alliance is now a different sort of alliance and is committing itself to a readiness force now in due course of 300,000 instead of 40,000. That was always a pretty big change, getting into 40,000 of high readiness troops. Now 300,000, I mean, that'll take some time. But the whole alliance, we wondered whether the Ukrainian war would administer either a shot in the arm or a shot in the head to the alliance, and it's turned out to be a pretty big shot in the arm. So the alliance has never been stronger. That was one aspect of the summit. And of course, the other aspect is Ukraine, and whether Ukraine can be given some sort of assurances that it will be brought into NATO at some point in the future. And yes, it was given those assurances, but with no timeline, because there can't be a timeline. And there's a deal of ambiguity about this, because people are saying, well, Ukraine must come into NATO when the war is over. Well, the antagonism won't be over for a couple of generations. So you're probably talking about 40 or 50 years. So that's not what they mean. What they mean is at some point when the fighting stops, when Ukraine is in a favorable position, as we hope it will be, then NATO might find a way of interposing itself, let's say in a ceasefire, in an armistice, in such a way as to stabilize that situation so that we can rebuild European security on that. So that's where the summit really was, strengthening NATO as NATO and beginning to create this idea of a new architecture, but at some indefinable point when Ukraine coming into NATO would be stabilizing, not destabilizing.
And like you said, there was a level of ambiguity in what NATO were able to promise to Ukraine. Do you think President Zelensky of Ukraine, is going to come away from this summit feeling like he's really got something to show for it?
Zelensky was very clear before the summit began that he wouldn't go unless there was something really solid on the table. He wasn't going to go just for warm words. And he was in a way frustrated and exasperated when he was on the way to the summit, I think. And I think that a lot of that has got to do with tiredness and war weariness, which everyone suffers from. However, I think the Ukrainians came away from this summit with more than they might have expected, not everything they would have wanted, but they came away with a series of bilateral guarantees, an assurance that the membership action plan for normal membership would not apply to them. So like Sweden and Finland, they could come into the alliance very quickly once the decision in principle was taken, rather than having to jump through several hoops over a number of years. That was quite important. There was a big package of military aid, another package of military aid that was on the table, and a series of bilateral arrangements, plus this idea of a Ukrainian NATO council. Now, there was already a Ukrainian NATO commission, and there used to be a Russian NATO council. That didn't do anybody any good. But nevertheless, a Ukrainian NATO council might turn out to be important to Ukraine, and it gives Ukraine a sort of equal status as a 50% member at that meeting to show how important it is. And there was Zelensky, the young president of a state at war, having a one-to-one with Biden, a one-to-one with Rishi Sunak, a one-to-one with Chancellor Scholz. I mean, there he was, as it was being feted at the summit in ways that would never happen to Vladimir Putin in any forum that he might care to go to.
So Baltic states such as Lithuania and Estonia have kind of criticised NATO a little bit, comparing their promises to Ukraine with appeasement for their lack of detail. How closely have Baltic states been watching this conflict, do you think, and especially NATO's response for their own security?
The Baltic states feel as if they are almost in the front line themselves. I mean, Kaja Kallas, who's the Prime Minister of Estonia, put it very well. And she said, the Russians will take every advantage. They demand everything, they give nothing. And if they just keep demanding, somebody will appease them. And then they get half of something they didn't have to start with. So that's the way they do it. That's the way they've always done it. And so the Baltic states are the toughest of all. They are the most hard line of all in their anti-Russian rhetoric. But you've got to remember this, that the Baltics can be as brave as they like. It's the Americans who'll pick up most of the tab for their bravery. And so there is always this sense that the Baltics always want NATO to do more. But NATO can only move at the speed of the consensus. And the consensus among 32 is much, much stronger than it used to be. But it's not all that the hardliners would like. It's not all that the British would like, because Britain is now one of the hardliners in NATO. And by and large, it's the northern countries, the Scandinavians, the Baltics, and Britain, who take the hardest view. But some of the other members don't take so hard a view. And the United States and Germany are much more cautious because they know that people will look to them to make good on the promises that smaller states want the alliance to make.
So you were talking about some of the defence packages and equipment that was promised. We've heard a little bit more about long-range missiles from NATO countries. We understand the US is still considering sending the ATACMS, but now France says it does want to send its Scalp missiles. Is Ukraine going to see these as kind of good substitute for the ATACMS system?
The Storm Shadow, which is what the Ukrainians have got from Britain, we don't know how many, but several hundred. But the British stocks are said to be between about 700 and 1,000 Storm Shadows, and they're very good. They work very well. And we know that we say we've given several hundred of them. My guess is maybe we've given half of the stock, but I'm just guessing. France has agreed, they run it under a different name, but it's the Storm Shadows. So France is also now contributing Storm Shadows because they are making a difference. They do the same job as a cruise missile that the American ATACMS would do, which is their ground-based missile, can be fired from a HIMARS system and has a range of about 150 kilometers. So it's really very good. And the ATACMS would be a very good weapon for the Ukrainians to have. But in a way, the Storm Shadow is better if they have enough of them, because that can be launched from an aircraft. And so the aircraft can fly to anywhere it needs to in Ukraine and then release its Storm Shadow. So that gives it complete coverage. Whereas the ATACMS is ground-based. It can only fire from one place. It may not have quite the same flexibility in coverage. But the advantage of ATACMS is that the United States has many, many, many of them. And so rather than sending a few hundred Storm Shadows, the Americans could send several thousand ATACMS to Ukraine, and they would make a difference. And believe me, the Ukrainians need them for the offensive that's coming, because they don't have air superiority, because they haven't got the aircraft that they really need. And so they're having to compensate for that in different ways, which is the ability to strike behind Russian lines with long range, as they call them, deep fires. In the military, and a deep fire is like a Storm Shadow. It's a deep fire munition, and then ATACMS would be a deep fire munition.
So we've also heard from Germany, another NATO member, that they will send more Leopard tanks and infantry fighting vehicles. Do you think Ukraine is going to be able to deploy that equipment for this push we've been hearing about in their counteroffensive?
The Ukrainians are certainly losing some tanks and armoured fighting vehicles as they're pushing forward, and that's inevitable. They're bound to. So the Germans have said that they will send more Leopard 1s, which are the Leopard 1As, which are still pretty good. They're not as good as the Leopard 2, but they work. And one of the most important things about the Western tanks is that the crew survives a hit. generally speaking. Russian tanks, when the tank is hit, the crew usually are lucky to survive. In Western tanks, are much more survivable because of the internal layout and the fact that in Western tanks, the ammunition is compartmentalized so that a hit in one part of the tank doesn't set off all the ammunition, whereas in Russian tanks, most of the ammunition gets set off if the tank is severely hit. So the Leopards are important. The Germans are sending Marder fighting vehicles as well. They're important. And the Ukrainians will always need more armoured vehicles. I mean, Britain is sending several hundred more armoured vehicles of various sorts. They'll always need more because at the moment they've got these 9, they call them the Big Nine, the 9 brigades, armoured and mechanised brigades, which are the spearhead of this offensive. It's not all they've got by any means, but it's the spearhead, mainly made up of fairly fresh troops who are newly trained, and therefore that's both good and bad. They'll be keen and enthusiastic, but also they don't have the same battle experience as some of the other troops. Now, these 9 brigades have not been heavily engaged at all. Most of them have not been used yet. At least 6 of them haven't been used. 3 of them may have started to be used. But the Ukrainians will need to build more brigades behind them as and when they start to make some breakthroughs, which I think they will quite soon, some bigger breakthroughs. Then they'll need to push material in behind the breakthrough in new brigades being formed and sent forward in order to exploit the advantages. So yes, they'll need as much as we can send them and then some.
So we think some of this new equipment going in could be a sign that Ukraine is now starting to commit some of those Western trained forces to the front?
Ukraine is committing some of its Western equipment to the front. There's no indication yet that it's sending its Western trained people to the front, although that can't be long delayed. At the moment, we're waiting for the second phase, which is the Ukrainians have opened up 3 areas in Bakhmut, around Bakhmut, from Orikhiv to Velika Novosilka in the south, and then in the west at Kherson. They've got 3 areas where they've made some quite deep penetrations, but they've not broken through most of the Russian defenses. That's still to come. And so in one or more of those 3 places, we would expect the Ukrainians to start to push much more vigorously, and that can't be long delayed. That's a matter of days or at most a couple of weeks away, because the delay is burning summer. They're burning into the summer, and they can't afford to wait too much longer, whatever the state of their other forces are. This offensive, this won't finish the war for Ukraine. There will be other offensives after this one. But for all sorts of political reasons, this offensive has to be successful. It has to look decisive. It has to look as if it is changing the balance of forces on the battlefield. And that's got to happen somewhere between now and, let's say, the end of October, when things start to get wet and cold, and everything will be much more difficult for the side going forward in the offense.
So we know that the war isn't just taking place kind of on the front. Russia has, over the last few days during the summit, been striking major Ukrainian cities. And we've also heard that Germany is going to send more missile defense systems like the Patriot battery. How crucial have these air defense systems become for Ukraine in defending major cities?
The air defense assets they've got are very important. Patriot is the best. And Germany is now going to send 2 more Patriot batteries to add to the, I think, the one that they had already from Germany, and I think 2 American batteries that they got through Poland. Patriot will shoot down anything, and it will shoot down ballistic missiles. The thing about Patriot is that it's very expensive, and so you don't want to use Patriot missiles, which cost a great deal, against a cheap Iranian drone. And so you need the Ukrainians need a sort of layered system of defenses, which they have got. And so they've got like Gepard, the German Gepard, quick-firing gun. That's very effective against drones. Very fast-firing, ground-based gun. They've got other forms of air defense systems. The Iris-T system, also from Germany. They've got some French systems, got some British systems. So they've got lots of different things, and they have been quite successful. I mean, they've brought down in the order of 90% of all of the missiles and drones that have been fired at them since last October. This offensive, this air offensive, began on the 10th of October last year, and it was, first of all, it was progressing about every 2 weeks. The Russians conducted another big attack, and then on the 1st of May they began this more or less continuous air offensive, pretty well every day. There aren't many days when they don't send something, And so every day there are usually 20 or 30 drones and missiles. Some days it's been as high as 80 odd. And they've been doing this now for over 2 months, trying to exhaust the ammunition which the Ukrainians have got in their air defense system. So it's very important, not just that the Ukrainians get more systems, but that they get plenty of ammunition for their systems. So Patriot is top of the range. That's what you use against ballistic missiles. Gepard is very, very good, bottom of the range. That's what you use against cheap drones, because it essentially just machine guns them out of the sky in a very traditional way. But my goodness, it works.
If I can bring us back to Vilnius and the NATO summit quickly, shortly beforehand, Turkey lifted its veto on Sweden joining the organisation, bringing the number of members up to 32. If Putin's stated aim was to limit NATO, to stop an expansion, stop the organisation getting bigger, surely that objective has now failed.
Putin began this war on a huge, massive, historic miscalculation that Ukraine could be, as it were, beaten in 3 days. It was essentially a military-backed coup which he launched. It wasn't really an invasion. He didn't have enough troops there to invade a country of 44 million people, the biggest land area in Europe, apart from Russia itself. He would have needed about 6 times that number to invade the country successfully. What he tried February last year was a military-backed coup to get hold of Zelensky and kill him, plus anybody else who was close to him, replace him very quickly within 72 hours, suppress any dissent in the major cities, and then sit on Ukraine as an annexed province of the Russian Federation. That was a massive, huge miscalculation. And from then on, everything that has happened in the war has been a strategic defeat for Putin. I mean, all he's doing now is trying to hang on grimly to what gains that they have got in the Donbass and in southern Ukraine. They control about 15%, 16% of the Ukrainian land area, and that includes Crimea, which was seized in 2014. So they've got a piece of Ukraine, and they're grimly trying to hold on to it with no other strategic element, no other strategic calculation other than to hold on to what they've got. And in the meantime, Russia has essentially taken itself off the front line of world politics. It's playing for influence in the global south, in Africa now in particular, and is having some success in that. But its economy is now, notwithstanding the fact that it's cash rich, because it's an energy-based economy, oil and gas, but the underlying economy is suffering tremendously. And strategically, I mean, Putin has now united Europe against it. He's got the biggest, most impressive NATO that Russia has ever faced since 1949. And he's got a military which is essentially dismantling itself in an unwinnable war in Ukraine. And his only strategic aim now is not to win the war, but not to lose it. And the only way he can be sure not to lose it is to be saved by China. The Chinese will not allow Russia to lose this war. And so we're in the territory of deciding, well, he's not going to win it. What does not losing look like? Is there some sort of ceasefire we might conceive of next year, favorable to Ukraine, which somehow can be stabilized in some institutional arrangement? That's a very ambiguous area. It's all full of grey zones. But Putin has got no chance of winning. So strategically, he made his choice in February last year. It was a disaster, and he's gone from disaster to disaster strategically ever since.
And in Ukraine and among Russia's military ranks, we've actually been seeing a lot of high-ranking Russian commanders being killed under seemingly mysterious circumstances. First, we had this Russian submarine commander, and then Lieutenant General Oleg Toskov, who was deputy commander of Russia's southern military district, has been killed in what is possibly a Storm Shadow strike. What sort of strategic impact can deaths of high-ranking commanders have on Russia's military?
Yeah, it certainly doesn't help when senior commanders are either removed or killed or assassinated. I mean, Ritsky, the submarine commander, he was just shot in a park on his run. Now, whether the Ukrainians were behind that or whether that was gangland, who knows? I mean, there is so much gangsterism in Russia. To my mind, it's just as likely he was killed in a gang feud as for any other political reasons. I mean, he was shot in Krasnodar. Zokov, who's deputy commander of Southern Military District, I mean, he was certainly killed in this hotel in Berdyansk, and it looks like a storm shadow. I mean, that would have been capable of doing it. And what that also tells you is that the Ukrainians are getting quite a lot of good information from local Ukrainians about where Russians are, where they're staying, what they're using. And the Russians are very, very aware of this, and they're clamping down in Gestapo fashion on any indications that people are making phone calls or spotting where commanders might be. But that's important. I mean, also, Ivan Popov, who's the commander of the 58th Combined Arms Army, even today, I mean, Popov looks as if he's been removed for criticizing the lack of artillery available to the 58th. And the fact that Russia is losing so many commanders, some assassinated, some targeted by the Ukrainians, some removed by the Russians. And we don't know, for instance, I mean, Gerasimov is supposed to be in charge of the whole operation. He's only made one remote appearance. There's no indication that he's really in charge of this since the failed march on Moscow by Prigozhin and the Wagner group. Sorovikin, who is the deputy commander of the whole operation, one of the three deputies, he's not been seen at all. So there's nobody at the top who's obviously in command. And you can see what that's doing. I mean, down at the battlefront, people are just carrying on with their orders with no flexibility. Just local commanders are making their decisions, and they're throwing troops in one after another, and they're using this concept of disposable troops who are there to take the fire, blocking troops behind them who are there to shoot them if they retreat, and then regulars behind them again to move forward if there is any gain. And they've made some gains like that. Some gains up in the north, north of Crimea, and further south at Avdiivka. The Russians have conducted some reasonably successful local counterattacks using those sorts of tactics, but they're hugely expensive in troops. They use up massive amounts of ammunition. And you can see that Russia's command system is under severe strain. And so senior commanders are being killed or removed. Junior commanders are frightened of disobeying orders, and they're just throwing their orders down to the poor guys on the ground who've got to carry them out. What this is, it's a lack of what's known in the West and in the British military as mission command. Mission command is where each commander tells his subordinates what they need to achieve, and the subordinates work out the best way to achieve it. So you give them the choice of how to do it. But as long as the mission command is clear, then everybody can, as it would, give their best in the most flexible way. The Russians don't have that at all. They don't do mission command. They just do orders from the top to the bottom, and they don't change from the top right to the bottom. And so somebody at the bottom has got to run at a machine gun.
Professor Michael Clarke, thank you very much for speaking to us today.